Hello and welcome to the first full-length episode of the Suspicious Transaction Report, a podcast brought to you by the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, kindly supported by Accurus Risk Intelligence. I'm your host, Isabella Chase, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing what's been going on in recent financial crime news with my guests Samantha Sheen and Misha Glenny. And later, we'll be considering the effectiveness of the AML regime and what can be done to improve it with Matthew Redhead. So let's turn to the news. With me today is Sam Sheen, a financial crime prevention professional with over 15 years of practical experience in compliance. Sam holds a number of qualifications and is recognized as a subject matter expert in the field of financial crime, focusing on European regulatory developments and emerging financial crime risks. Thanks for being here today, Sam.
Thanks for inviting me.
And with Sam, we also have Misha Glenny, a former BBC Europe correspondent and author of McMafia, Seriously Organised Crime, a book which maps the globalization of organised crime following the collapse of communism. The book was turned into a very popular BBC and AMC TV drama, and we hear that season 2 is on its way.
Season 2 is on its way. We're just emerging from what's called development hell, and it's looking good.
Well, we're all very excited for when that comes out. So let's kick off with the latest on the Iranian oil tanker saga. You might remember from earlier this summer, an Iranian oil tanker supposedly en route to Syria was seized in the port of Gibraltar. The vessel was then released after assurances were given that the oil wouldn't be taken to Syria. But last week, it emerged that the captain of the ship received a number of emails from US authorities offering him millions of dollars to dock the vessel in a US-friendly port. He refused, and subsequently, both the vessel and the captain have been placed on the US sanctions list. And just yesterday, reports emerged that the oil has now successfully been sold in Syria. What does this story really tell us about the changing nature of US financial power? Especially when we look at Iran, do we think that the US is beginning to lose some of its clout here? Sam, I'm going to come to you first.
Oh, yay. Me first. This is one of those what were you thinking moments, particularly around how you actually deal with this in terms of communication to your compliance staff. You know, one of the things we always emphasize to compliance teams who deal with sanctions and sanction restrictions is these are foreign policy tools. They're designed to change behavior and encourage deterrence. And I can't see how we're going to successfully explain this onward to those staff to say, but it's okay, you can offer essentially what would otherwise be considered a bribe to have someone, deliver a boat. Is that really what we're talking about here? To say nothing of the personal safety of the captain, even if he had contemplated doing that in the first place. So it's a really, really strange maneuver.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels pretty punitive on the captain who, we don't know what his background is here. He is just, in his eyes, might just be captaining this ship. And now his whole financial life is on hold because he's been placed on a US sanctions list.
Yeah, it feels really not just punitive, but it's sort of one step away. I had a colleague in the United States write to me this morning saying, he feels like we're one step away from a new episode of Dog Bounty Hunter, where we're, the next thing we're going to be putting bounties on people's heads and people should run out and take action to further prevent sanctions, which hosts a whole load of new risks, not only for the individuals involved, but whether or not that's in any way the direction we want to go with sanctions policy.
Absolutely. Misha, what's your view on all of this?
Well, this takes place within significant shifts in geopolitics at the moment, and different strategies emerging on the part of the great powers, which often conflict with each other. So, for example, sanctions on Iran at the moment, post its scrapping of the nuclear deal, have been imposed by the United States, but not by the European Union, not by China, not by Russia. So what this is it's a reflection of the increasingly unilateral nature of global politics, whether it's on trade, whether it's on terrorism, whatever it is. And the United States are out on their own on this particular one. I thought it was quite indicative in some ways of the style of the Trump administration, where I quote from the letter or the email that was sent to Captain Kumar, who is, of course, an Indian citizen. He's not Iranian, who was captaining the Grace 1, or the Adrian Darya-1, as it's now called. He received an email from Brian Hook, Secretary of State, who works for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and serves as the US representative for Iran. And the email goes, "I'm writing with good news." And it's sort of like the kind of scams you get from Nigerians. It's like a 419 scam.
Yeah.
And so I would have forgiven Captain Kumar if he'd have sort of, sent it straight to the trash can. But this really is, the United States have a long history of putting out bounties, but generally they tended to put them out for specific people who, for some reason, were fugitives from justice. This, as far as I understand, is a fairly new strategy that you target individuals when it comes to imposing a sanctions regime, which has not been agreed upon by international institutions. So for me, what the story reflects is that we are into a new and unpredictable world, and this is just one of the latest manifestations of it.
Absolutely. I think it just speaks to the wider question is the US just completely overusing sanctions, just using them whenever they feel like it, and kind of to what you were saying earlier, Sam, lacking a strategy.
Yeah, and it feels like a taking sides thing. And, we already have enough complications here in Europe. We have our own separate sanctions regime. Since the US has moved out of the JCPOA, things have been quite difficult for financial institutions to figure out how to effectively screen, detect, and comply with sanctions that would apply to them. It makes it even more difficult, though, when it seems to be the challenge isn't to be complying effectively with the regulatory requirements, but it almost becomes a high school-like fight of who do you believe more? Who has made the right judgment? And that shouldn't be what it's about in sanctions. And I'm sure that this captain, for whatever it was worth, there were lots of other considerations that had nothing to do with foreign policy that went about his head in deciding whether this was a good deal or not. But hopefully we're not going to head in this direction, because truly it's getting incredibly complicated now for sanctions compliance people to do their jobs.
And remember, the captain had already had a fairly stressful voyage. He had, of course, been stopped and guided into the port at Gibraltar by British forces, who claimed this was actually also wound up with the geopolitics of Brexit and a sinking administration, which was Theresa May's administration. And it looked to me like the then Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt was trying to show his qualities of machismo with this. And then they realized that they had suddenly plunged themselves into a nightmarish standoff between the United States and Europe. And although they were appealing to EU law, they decided in the end that discretion was the better part of valor, and they let it go, thereby, of course, further irritating Trump. So you have to be really careful if you get involved with this. I was also thinking about, if Captain Kumar had accepted the inducement, where would he actually go?
Exactly.
He might go to Cyprus. Would he really consider going to Israel? I doubt it.
Yeah.
So there weren't that many places to go. Let's face it, Libya is not a terribly friendly place for this at the moment, nor is Turkey. So it seems to me a fairly crass operation, but it highlights this issue of where are we heading with sanctions? Does the UN actually function anymore in terms of trying to coordinate disparate interests?
Absolutely. If you look at the P5 and the members of the Security Council who have to find consensus on sanctions, we just don't really see that anymore at all, other than on North Korea. And although we imagine that regime will continue, I can't imagine you're going to take decisive sanctions from the UN on Iran anytime soon.
I just think it's going to get more and more complicated as the US continues to take its own stance on things and decide what it wants to decide on its own. And, at the end of the day, actually trying to comply with these things is just becoming a dog's breakfast.
Yeah, it is. And of course, it all goes back to Trump's decision to remove the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. And the reason why that's very, very important is this was a decision with monumental consequences for global stability. And it was done purely because he disliked his predecessor, and he saw this as his predecessor's achievement, and so he thought, right, well, I'll put a spanner in that works, thank you very much. And what that suggests, like this example with the tanker, is that We have moved into territories that are so uncharted and unpredictable. And this is a sideshow compared to what is going on with China at the moment. And I'm sure finance and money will come into play when it comes to the relationship between China and the United States.
Yeah, once again, it's in the UK, we're aware of this problem at the moment, but when personal spats and egos get in the way of sensible politics, things don't seem to go that well. But in this scenario, it seems like it's a great time to be a sanctions lawyer. So, that's one sector that's doing well out of this. So to move on to our next piece of recent financial crime news, last week, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs issued its largest ever fine for money laundering. The fine of £7.8 million was placed against a money service business in the Edgware Road area of London. The MSB had failed to carry out a proper risk assessment, keep proper records, didn't have proper policies, controls, or procedures, including fundamental customer due diligence measures, and its staff weren't properly trained in countering the risk from money laundering. Simon York, the head of fraud investigations at HMRC, said, "This record fine shows we mean business. So get your house in order." Pretty strong words from HMRC. And I think this fine is significant for a number of reasons. And one of them is because MSBs are notorious for their high risk of money laundering and for terrorist financing. I was wondering, in your own personal professional experiences, how have you interacted with MSBs in the past? Sam, as an ex-regulator, and Misha, in your investigations?
And also someone who travels to obscure places all the time and actually often takes advantage of the services which MSBs offer. I beg your pardon. So first of all, why do they exist? Well, they exist fundamentally for two reasons. One is the transfer of remittances, absolutely clear. And that is the bulk of the work of the MSBs. As I was coming down the Uxbridge Road in West London, coming here to Russi, in the space of a mile, I counted 17 MSBs on my little bus journey. They're all over the place in London. And that's because of the fact that we're so dependent on foreign labour for our markets. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is very, very important, if you go to Stansted or Heathrow and you try and change money at either Moneycorp or Travelex, who have monopolies on foreign exchange at airports, let me tell you what happened on July the 16th of this year. London Stansted customers would have received just 80 cents, that's out of euros, 80 cents to the pound, losing travellers the equivalent of £138 worth of euros compared to the market rate for every £500 exchanged. These places are legalised extortion. And the reason why MSBs, money services bureaus, businesses and bureaus, are so popular is because they give you a decent, proper exchange rate. And so I would say that the industry needs to look at itself, because what they are doing, the MSBs, is they are, it's supply and demand. There's huge demand for their services. Now, the third thing, the consequence of all this is, of course, is the hawala, or the flying money system that they're involved in, is fabulous for laundering money, for terrorist finances, for criminals to use. And when I was researching McMafia, virtually everyone I was investigating or talking to used these services because they're convenient, they're very difficult to track, and it's mostly done in cash through phone calls. So yes, this is a problem, and HMRC has got to go after them. In terms of, what is the impact of individual businesses in London on the money laundering market, probably not very much, because there you want to have a look at banks, hedge funds, and so on and so forth. But as long as we have Moneycorp and Travelex giving you 80 cents to the pound at airports, people are going to be using these things. Final point I'll make on this is fintech, of course, is changing everything. So instead of having to go to Moneycorp or Travelex, you can now use TransferWise or Revolut or whatever. And you can start you can use different currencies with the same credit card, and the exchange rate is reasonable and the commission rate is so it may be about to change, but the remittances thing remains the central issue and difficulty, because people who are remitting money don't have very much of it, and they don't want to be losing money on expensive bank charges.
Absolutely. And, there are a lot of countries around the world, especially where the UK has strong remittance corridors too, which rely on, from GDP, for their GDP, on remittances coming from this country. But this fine does show that they do pose a risk. So, Sam, what do you think?
I don't think anything's new about this. I just think it's the quantum. Look, in start of January this year, we had another Western Union fine imposed by the French regulator. Again, the same themes were coming out: the vetting of high-risk customers, not understanding where the money flows were coming from. Then in April of 2019, we had FinCEN, who started bringing into the family of MSBs the peer-to-peer virtual currency exchanges, many of whom are not recognizing they fit in the MSB family. But I take a very different take from this. And I do remember when I worked in the private sector, dealing with banks who had one sniff of something high risk, something not operating consistently with an MSB customer, and immediately wanting to exit the business. And I think the bigger question has been lost here, which is, does the anti-money laundering framework set up primarily for banks work when applied to MSBs? And the answer is simply it doesn't. It doesn't mitigate the risks properly. It doesn't help to prevent the sort of misuse that happens through illicit actors. And, in other frameworks, in other regulatory spheres, when they do impact assessments, they also do periodic reviews of regulatory frameworks to see, are they still doing what they were intended to do? And it really has been some time that we've actually looked at our regulatory framework and said, does this work to mitigate the risks in MSBs? Because they don't operate like any other financial services business. They're very, very different. And in turn, the way that risks arise, the way that the threats expand are very, very different. And, we see a lot of great discussion at the level of FATF around cryptocurrency, and GDF has been involved. This weekend, just passed at the Cambridge Economic Crime Symposium, lots of discussion around that regulatory framework. But I think if we keep trying to mash the square peg of MSBs into the round hole of the banking regulation landscape around AML, it's not going to work. And I do think we need to be alive to the fact that the unintended consequence of this is there will be certain communities within the world who will lose access to the financial industry. They can't all readily get prepaid cards. They can't jump on TransferWise. They aren't all walking around with a Monzo or Revolut card where they can move from border to border. Exactly. And I think, it would be very brave and bold for regulators to start to bring in the MSBs, both those from the fintech sector and the more traditional ones, to actually sit down and go, what's going on here? Because Western Union has done some fantastic work in the area of tracking returning foreign fighters' terrorist financing. They've done some great work with their human trafficking program. I know they've got another great program on right now around wildlife trafficking. And what we don't want to do is discourage these industries from just not playing with anyone anymore, because that information is really, really valuable. So I think it's time for a revisit, to be perfectly honest. We can keep finding them, but we need to ask, is it not working? Is that why this non-compliance keeps happening?
And also, I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying, Sam, and you've completely convinced me in the space of 3 minutes. I hadn't been looking at it from that point of view, but that seems very rational, although it ties up with what I was thinking about the remittance industry as being so important. But of course, there was a time, and that was after 2001, where basically they were all closed down. I mean, literally overnight on Oxford Street and on the Uxbridge Road and on the Edgware Road where these busts took place, the money service businesses, they all closed down, and the police were on them like that because, of course, there was all the response to 9/11 and everyone was in a state of panic and so on and so forth. What that did was to send them underground, of course. And when they go underground, they attract many more sort of dubious characters than they otherwise would. And so clearly, and to back up what Sam's saying, is this hasn't been sorted out yet. We don't know how to do it. And you're absolutely right. The difference between something like the Danske Bank case and what's going on up the Edgware Road, they're on different planets.
And there's a really great example I have where one MSB I spoke to was trying to explain to me how they train all the people at the 7-Elevens somewhere in Europe here who operate as their brokers, right? They're agents. And they said, well, what we do is we start a rumor that we're going to be coming around and do secret shopping, and we're going to pretend that we want to send some money, and then we're going to test to see if they get all the KYC properly. And that forces all of them in a panic to go on the online e-learning thing that they have to do. And then they do the exam really, really quickly. So that's how we get them all to do it. And I'm thinking, how on earth does that help you mitigate financial crime? Although it was quite amusing, they found a way to get people to do it. You sort of thought, and that's just to get a tick in the box when the regulator comes to check.
Well, that reminds me very much of digital security, digital hygiene regimes in big companies. It's just a little test you do online, and no one understands what on earth they're doing. They just guess what the right answer is.
Yes.
And it doesn't change people's behavior or habits, and it doesn't solve the problem.
And, we've been having the conversation for a long time, got to get rid of that tick box and build it more into a culture of compliance. I completely agree with both of what you're saying. And I think the government in the UK has a good opportunity now as part of the economic crime plan. If, fully carried out, there will be a full review of HMRC as a regulator. And that could give them a great opportunity to consider how they interact with MSBs. This fine, I think you can partly attribute to a targeted week of action. So not quite, start spreading rumors, but a good example of collaboration between law enforcement and different agencies trying to change a behavior in this industry. I feel like we could talk about that topic for ages, but we have one last topic to cover this week, and that is the Laundromat. This is not of the Azerbaijani or Troika variety, but a film that was premiered on the 1st of September at the Venice Film Festival, starring Meryl Streep, Antonio Banderas, and Gary Oldman. It's the story of an insurance fraud that, once investigated by Streep, uncovers the Panama Papers and the goings-on at Mossack Fonseca. At the premiere of the film star Streep said, "This is a funny way of telling a joke that's being played on us all. It's a crime not without victims, and many of them are journalists." I want to ask my guests, what do you think the role is of popular culture, films like this, maybe, TV series like McMafia, in raising public awareness of financial crime?
Well, financial crime is not a subject that lends itself immediately to visualization in television and film. And we knew when we were doing McMafia that this was going to be a big problem because money laundering is a big part of McMafia. Hoss Amini, the writer, and James Watkins, the director, I think came up with a great solution in which they visualized the process of layering, of shell company creation, of Hawala, the MSBs that we were just talking about. And we did it fairly short. It was always there in the background that there was money laundering going on, but much of it is done on keyboards and screens, for example, and that is what we call television mogadon.
There's nothing sexy about a swift statement.
There's really nothing about it at all. However, here's the really important thing. I wrote McMafia it was published in 2008, and it did pretty well around the world, was translated into a lot of languages, but it's a book, and at most you're going to get 500,000 people reading it, many of whom are just interested non-fiction general readers. Quite a few policy people read it, police read it, gangsters read it, blah, blah, blah. But it didn't amount to public pressure. We put on the TV show, and that was now 18 months ago. And what do we get? Within 3 months, we have a law going through Parliament, which is dubbed by all the main press the McMafia law.
You did have a fair few of ministers quoting
we had
McMafia.
Ministers quoting it, and all of a sudden, money laundering and what's happened in this capital, London, over the past 20, 25 years becomes a subject which is part of public discourse. I have long considered that although books are very, very important, if you want to have an impact in terms of public policy and public debate, you've got to shift over to television drama, and much more so than film these days, because film is in decline, whereas television drama is going through its golden age.
It really is.
Thanks to what we call the battle of the platforms. It will it will that battle will be won or lost within the next 10 years, and then there won't be nearly so much money for TV drama. But for the moment, if you want to get a big, important subject out there, come up with a gripping TV drama and you'll get it in the headlines.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually, just briefly, actually, Breaking Bad had a lot of money laundering in it, and they did a good job on that. But Sam, talking of film, what was you've watched the trailer?
I've watched the trailer. I'm of two minds. I haven't seen the whole thing yet, so I'm hoping it has similar content to The Big Short. And the reason why I say that is, if you can get Selena Gomez to explain to people how those toxic products were put together and how they were traded in such a simple way, that's absolutely fantastic, because I think the thing that's really needed is around consumer protection. So consumers understand what they're buying. And if they don't understand what a banker's telling them or an investment advisor is telling them, sometimes being able to have film or television programs that simplify the explanations are really great. Where I struggle with the Panama Papers, though, is that the societal effect is really distant, right? And the fact of the matter is, this wasn't discovered because a lady wanted to challenge her insurer not paying off a policy, right? This resulted as a result of a whistleblower. Loved the Obermeyer's book, thought it was fantastic, but then I'm a compliance geek and I'm prepared to spend the time to read it, right? Yep. But I've seen some great stuff like Dirty Money on Netflix. That's a great series of little episodes. I was horrified to learn about my home country, Canada, and the whole scam around maple syrup. I didn't know anything about that.
Phenomenal strategic reserve.
There's a whole organized crime community around maple syrup.
I know.
This sort of maple syrup ripoff thing.
It's completely ruined every breakfast I've ever had involving pancakes. But, I think I'm kind of on the fence on this. I think that there are lots of great ways that you can explain to people how complicated financial crime is. And I think as long as the message is there about how people get impacted by it, because I tend to worry sometimes that as we get a lot of financial crime stories out in popular media, people become anesthetized to the actual impact. So if they haven't lost money personally, if they don't know somebody who's lost their home, the crisis was now 10, 11 years gone by. A lot of people, especially millennials, don't feel it. They don't see it. It's something that's foreign and far away. And I just hope that with the funny side of the Panama Papers, what's not lost there is that means countries who need this money, who need the tax income, they don't get it. That means, roads don't get built, hospitals don't get funded. That it is a big deal. Although I think the best revenge on criminals is to make fun of them. Hence why I think Gary Oldman and Antonio Banderas have probably done an absolutely stellar job.
Yeah, I mean, it's one question that I had when watching the trailer, where Panama Papers were 2016, so next year will be 4 years on, and it's great to have another reason to talk about them, only because what's happened, what has really changed since the Panama Papers? You still have lawyers and trust and service company providers as unregulated as they were before. Not that regulation solves all problems, but
No, but you've also had Donald Trump as president of the United States, and he has been, behind the bluster. This is one of the things that I think we're all beginning to realize about Donald Trump is that the tweets and the television persona and everything behind this, all sorts of things are going on. And Michael Lewis's latest book actually demonstrates what's happening in the court system in the United States. The same is happening with regulation as well, when it comes to various things which he's tried to block quietly without people noticing.
But the next big one, don't you think, really is, it's a shame it's in court right now, right? The next big one that will be the blockbuster in the cinemas will be 1MDB.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And not only for the fact of the shenanigans, because how completely ridiculous were they to be partying in clubs and buying expensive cars and,
funding the Wolf of Wall Street.
Flashing it all out there. But then to actually have gone and invested in shares in legitimate businesses, essentially polluting them with corrupt proceeds, which is now starting to come up in the courts to say, should those shares be confiscated? Should they be frozen? How should that work? And when you just see the sheer complicated nature of it, how many people missed it, you think, that will be the next exciting, interesting one. I know a book's come out, but I've not read that.
And there's the new book that's out on 1MDB. And also, I think Danske Bank is very interesting as well but the problem is about getting these to a wider audience is what you said, is you do have to simplify it. And I can tell you that any film, whether it's The Laundromat, whether it's McMafia, whether it's 1MDB, has at its heart a story of human beings confronting a personal journey and a conflict of this, that, or other type. And this is the really difficult thing, is getting the balance between the impact. Now, what we did with McMafia, to answer your point about, or actually, Sam, it was your point about, how do you get people to realize that actually this impacts on people? We were absolutely insistent that with the high life, we would show the low life as well. And we would show the connections between the high life and the low life, that the wealth of a certain community in London is actually built upon the complete destruction of people's lives, and if they're being trafficked or if they're involved in drugs or whatever it is that there is a connection. What's so important is for people to understand that money laundering is not a victimless crime. You can say it over and over again and they'll say, yeah, sure, we know. If you can show just how devastating the consequences can be, then you're onto something.
I think that's why The Big Short was so good. And I remember going down to Florida the following year, and I remember driving around and just seeing all the foreclosure signs and all the empty houses and people who had in real life abandoned their houses because they couldn't afford their mortgages. There were ghost towns. There were ghost towns in Florida where people had just run away because they couldn't pay these ridiculous mortgages that they'd been given. And, I think you're absolutely right. If it's got a really great, powerful message to it, I think the humor engages and it catches them in. And I am really excited to actually see what's going to come about of it.
Absolutely. So the Laundromat will get a 21-day release in the US and UK from the 27th of September, and it will go global, I'm assuming, on Netflix on the 18th of October.
But of course, it'll be playing in cinemas because Netflix want to put it up for an Oscar. So this is just on a minor thing that's happening.
Oh, it's so good to watch these with a crowd, though, isn't it? Listen to everybody react, and rather than sitting in your living room.
You should really. So Roma, for example, which was a Netflix production, they put out for a week in cinemas just so they could get an Oscar. But watching Roma on the big screen is an extraordinary experience. Watching it on your telly at home is actually rather tedious.
And on that note, I need to thank both of my guests for joining us today. You can hear more from them on social media by following Misha at Misha Glenny on Twitter, and Sam can also be found on Twitter on the handle at Samantha J. Sheen. Thank you so much both for being here.
Cheers. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome to the Suspicious Transaction Report's first deep dive session. In these segments of the SDR, we'll be interviewing the author of a brand new piece of financial crime research, discussing what they've found, what's new, and why this research matters now. In this episode, I'm joined by Matthew Redhead. Matthew is a financial crime risk professional with a wealth of experience working in both the public and private sectors. He's also an associate fellow at RUSI. Hi, Matthew, and thank you for being here.
Hello, Isabella, and thank you for having me.
You're here to tell us about your forthcoming RUSI paper, Deep Impact, how AML compliance in financial services needs to change to increase effectiveness. Can you give us an overview of the questions you wanted to answer in the course of this research?
I will. So, the context for this is the fact that we're 30 years in from the foundation of the Financial Action Task Force, and next year will be the 30th anniversary of the first version of the 40 recommendations. And it seems like a very good point at which to actually ask the question, how well is this model working? The paper looks at that question, particularly in the context of financial services. And obviously we could have tried to look at every single aspect, but it's a very difficult thing to do, and trying to get everything in 15,000 words is hard. So we look particularly at financial services. The objectives of the paper were to say, what do the FATF recommendations mean for financial services? How effective do we think that's been? What are the current things that banks, financial services, fintechs, and the public sector in combination with them are doing at the moment to try and make it more effective? And where do we think we're going in the future, which I think is a very interesting direction. In terms of the overall findings, I think, as we'll get into, I'm sure, the question of effectiveness is a really difficult one, because what do we mean by effective? If you look at the FATF methodology, effectiveness is what I would call program effectiveness, looking at if you were to put the key in the engine of the car, does the car switch on? Well, yes, it does, but it doesn't look at questions such as cost effectiveness. So, are there cheaper alternatives? What are the externalities? And above all, what kind of impact is this having on money laundering and underlying predicate crimes as well? And that makes life a bit difficult. And many of the professionals you talk to in the field feel that something is happening, but they're not quite sure what's happening and whether it's enough and whether it could be better, which is one of the things that leads to the drive for innovation, both with partnerships, technology, organizational agility within financial services. And those are all positive steps forward, although I think there's a lot to learn. I think one of the key points about this is evidence base, both in terms of what we're doing now and what we could do in the future. And so it's in many ways a sort of pointer towards more of a shared endeavor approach based on evidence, I would say, which I think chimes with a lot of what other people are saying as well. But I think the really key thing is making sure we've got the political will behind it to move it forward.
Thank you for that overview, and of what I must say I think is a really informative paper, which, as you say, asks very timely questions and gives what I would say are some pretty ambitious recommendations. But, like you say, we need to be ambitious and we need to be looking to the future. So do you think, just asking quite a big question to start off with, do you think we'll ever have a real understanding of effectiveness of the AML regime?
Well,
or is it a bit of a pointless endeavor?
That's an interesting question. I don't think difficult necessarily means pointless. As I said in my little recapitulation of the piece, you can think about effectiveness in several ways. I often think about it when I've done process evaluations on policy before. So you have your program effectiveness, your outcome effectiveness, and your cost effectiveness. So can you switch the engine on? Does the car start? Yes, program effectiveness. 2, how quickly does it get to its destination? Does it get to its destination? How does it compare with other policies? And then 3, how much does it cost in comparison? I think in terms of this particular world, we're actually making progress on the program effectiveness part. And I think that's what, the guidance from FATF and what you're seeing in terms of regulatory examinations, moving away from technical compliance, is going in the right direction there. And I think we'll have a much better sense of how well FIs are implementing the requirement and other obligated entities too. It's the outcome effectiveness, which is the big thing. And if you're going to look at outcome effectiveness, you've got to have a benchmark about what you're trying to tackle. So are you trying to tackle money laundering, or proceeds of crime, social harms, etc.? I think the key issue for that is defining exactly what you're trying to measure. I think there are, social scientists are fairly good at coming up with proxies as well. And I think one of the other things that is worth saying about this is you don't need a single measure. I mean, having worked in public policy myself, very often you can use, if you like, a sort of dashboard approach of a number of different potential indicators, which are going to give you a rough sense of the direction things are going. And I think that's one of the key issues here, is that even if the statistics or assessments that you're going to have are going to be rough and ready, they're going to develop over time. You're going to develop your confidence in them because you're going to improve your techniques. And the important thing about them is that they're going to give you a sense of whether things are broadly getting better or worse. And I don't think what we have at the moment really does that, with all due respect to national sort of threat assessments about this picture. So I think we'll get there, but I think it's going to be a slow process. And I know that years ago, sort of FATF did discuss overall measures for sort of scale of money laundering, all the rest of it, and then put that aside because it was politically quite difficult. I think if this is an important question, we need to focus on it. And there are plenty of academics who've raised this issue themselves who think there are ways forward in this. I
mean, one thing I think is interesting is, I think one of the problems with measuring effectiveness is actually it looks different to different actors. It looks different to the regulated, and it looks different to the regulator. But actually, when you talk about third measure effectiveness outcomes, we all are trying to achieve the same outcome. So it's funny how that sort of got lost along the way for the different sectors.
Correct. I don't think many of this, talking to people in doing this research, and as you say, I've got an experience in the financial services sector in a number of different dimensions over the years. I don't think any professional, whether they be a regulator, law enforcement, financial crime compliance professional, doesn't think that or isn't motivated to do something positive to fight financial crime. That is there. But often that gets lost, as you quite rightly say, in the to and fro of this framework, because of course, if you're having a regulatory exam, the exam is taking place where the regulator is saying, okay, have you got the right policies, procedures and controls in place? Yes, you have. How well are they working? Have you had any problems? And yes, you could say indirectly that is an element, a building block in overall effectiveness, but it does start taking you away from saying, well, what is the end goal in this? And I think that a key part of a broader definition of effectiveness has to say, okay, how does this all fit together? And is it making a difference overall? I think if you were to look at the FIs, I think there are a lot of people in financial institutions working in compliance and fraud and AML and all the rest of it who are really seriously motivated. I'm not saying that they're not in the public sector, they are, but they're very motivated by it. But they find themselves with no real sense of feedback, or not enough sense of feedback from what contribution they're actually making to the overall goal of fighting financial crime. And I think that could be a greater motivator as well.
Absolutely. And so this is one of the recommendations you make in your paper about looking at how do you sort of incentivize people to be better. And I think that's a why question that especially is being asked in the UK context of how can we improve feedback? How can you encourage people to sort of safely experiment with new things? It's something that I think the Americans have done well. But before we move on to that and your wider recommendations, I was wondering, is there any part of the system that you think is getting it right at the moment?
Oh, that's very interesting. And it depends on which jurisdiction you're talking about or what part of the world. I'll give I think in different ways, you can look at some very large FIs that are making some interesting changes. And very often they are FIs who've had serious kicking from regulators for failures in the past.
And just to clarify, we mean financial institutions.
I do beg your pardon, yes. In big insurers and all the rest of it, who are looking at failures of the past and saying, okay, how do we do this better from the perspective that they want to do better? There's a sort of genuine moral desire to do that, and also to keep the costs down because, of course, compliance is extremely costly and they are businesses. And I think you see things going on there. And a lot of the most interesting examples, particularly of organizational agility, are in that space because they have more to organize, bringing together different kinds of functions and trying to make things work in a more coherent way.
So have you seen any good examples that you can talk about of that organizational agility and structure change?
I have, but I probably can't talk about it.
Okay.
I don't know whether it would be appreciated. I've seen, let's say, several large international banks who have learned some very, very positive lessons in terms of how they combine together different elements of financial crime and not just financial crime functions. I am aware of one particular large bank which has done some very interesting things with the 3 lines of defense as well, which I think is a very important thing, which I should note. Of course,
can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by 3 lines of defense?
Yeah, of course. So there is a fairly common model in risk management generally called 3 lines of defense, which is of uncertain provenance and has been criticized in certain places, such as the House of Commons, because nobody's quite sure where it comes from. But it is broadly used in the financial services world to sort of identify who is responsible for what in terms of risk management. So the first line are the day-to-day people in charge of the risks. The second line are the people who set the policies and procedures in terms of monitoring those risks, and the third line is audit. Now, it sounds like a very sensible approach, but what often happens when you apply that over the top of requirements for financial crime, it becomes even more fragmented and you get lots of duplication between the different lines. And I'm aware, I will say I'm aware of a large global bank, and I'm also aware of a medium-sized European bank, and I'm also aware of a Japanese bank who are doing a lot of work to try and integrate the first and second lines, because they found that it was a considerable amount of disruption, unnecessary friction, let's put it that way, between the second line and the first line. And they're finding that by bringing these things together, they're smoothing things out considerably. Obviously, audit has to stay where it is because it has a key role. So there are examples. I can't really give you the names of the institutions.
No, we don't expect you to at all.
But it is working and making a difference. And also not only slims down the process, makes things cheaper, it also makes sure that things happen quicker. So one of the examples I use in the report is how transaction monitoring of certain types is being used immediately by relationship managers in one case, rather than it going through a usual process of going through investigators and triage and all this sort of thing. it's going straight, particularly on the sort of corporate side, straight to the relationship manager, and they can say, yes, I'm concerned. No, I'm not concerned for some of the volume stuff. And it just cuts out a lot of the noise.
Yeah, it sounds a lot what you're talking about here is the term that you use, proactive risk management.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for so long, we've seen people talking about the need to bake in a culture of compliance from the top down, moving away from, just a tick box exercise towards this more proactive risk management approach to compliance. Can you tell us more about, I mean, obviously you've given us some good examples there, but are there any sort of regulatory drivers that are asking FIs to move in that direction?
I think increasingly there are, because regulators are observing what's happening and seeing good practice in different locations. And I think there is gentle guidance in direction from regulators, I know, on both sides of the Atlantic. And I certainly know it happens here to say, you should be, looking perhaps more at X and think a little bit about that. Also as well, within the broader marketplace, it doesn't have to come from the regulators, because of course people are moving around a lot. People are moving from regulators into financial services firms and back again, and that knowledge is getting diffused. So one of the fascinating things I find when I go to an ACAMS event or what have you in the UK or wherever it might be, is how these ideas are not necessarily they don't have to be transferred institutionally. They happen almost through the network. It's by osmosis. That's not to say, of course, that regulators shouldn't be encouraging it. And I think there's a really important point here about learning the lessons of those who've gone first.
Yeah.
Because I should have to take my LinkedIn profile down to show to make sure that people don't know where I work. But I've seen lots of experimentation. I've seen things that have worked well and things that have worked less well, and organizations learning over time. I think it's important for those who are trying to actually deal with that now, they do learn those lessons. Now, I know some people say, well, it's a competitive advantage for those that went first, and I understand that, but perhaps I'm a bit old-fashioned. I don't see financial crime as being an area which really should be a competitive advantage.
Absolutely, and also for smaller financial institutions, it's good that they can learn from the lessons of the people who can afford to experiment maybe in a smaller area of their business, in a particular jurisdiction.
Yeah.
When you have, thousands of people sitting in compliance functions in comparison to, a smaller financial institution or a fintech who might have 10 people.
Exactly.
It's great that there are early adopters who are sort of pushing parameters and seeing where that will go.
Yeah.
So just one question about sort of compliance as a culture. You talk about in this paper that compliance really serves two masters, the regulators and the business. And just going back to, I guess, what we were saying earlier about outcomes being the prevention, detection of financial crime, where does law enforcement sit in all of this?
Yes, indeed. Law enforcement is in there because, of course, financial institutions, compliance functions are producing, they've got transaction monitoring, they're creating investigations internally. Those sometimes lead to suspicious transaction or activity reports, which then go to FIUs and get looked at by law enforcement agencies. So yes, they are part of the connective tissue of this framework. To the extent, and it's a good point that you make, how much are they guiding the concerns of what's going on within a private obligated entity that's making that reporting? I don't think it's anywhere near as influential as a regulator would be at present. I think it's getting better. Some of the most interesting interviews I did for this work were individuals who would actually operate in all three areas, who'd been senior compliance, senior regulator, and at senior law enforcement at different stages, which narrows down who I could be talking about. But anyway, talking about how they realized the narrowness of perspective as they moved through their career and spoke and took it from different positions. And, talking to them, their experience is that things are improving and that law enforcement feedback is being taken more seriously by regulators on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of what the private institutions are contributing. I still think there is some way to go on that. Yes, somewhere like FinCEN, for example, has, powers of censure, but not every similar body in every country does. And very often the relationships between the institutions and the regulators and law enforcement people they deal with are bilateral and not being conducted in a connected way. So can often feel slightly out of sync with each other. And, it's quite possible, as I'm aware, to be in an institution or aware of institutions where financial crime teams, fraud teams, AML, people working ABC, anti-bribery and corruption, are getting awards for their contribution to anti-financial crime and other underlying predicate crimes, not just in the UK, but more widely. But that isn't necessarily being reflective in the outcome of a regulatory exam, where they're ending up with, that's not offset against the negatives as well, which every institution has, even if it has a good framework. So I think those things need to be more integrated. And from the perspective of incentives, what law enforcement agencies think about what is happening should have a greater impact on the overall assessment of an institution's performance. They should be more of a regulatory voice than they are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking that, what is the role of law enforcement in informing regulation and wider legislation? If you look at, the huge review that we have going on at the moment in the UK, and initiatives such as the Economic Crime Plan, but also very similar conversations happening in the US, Canada. Where does law enforcement sit when informing these new rules and regulations? And then also, actually, if you think more internationally, because what we actually have here is an international problem, crime knows no borders, and for some reason compliance does. Where does law enforcement sit in informing the work of FATF and bodies like that? Yes,
that's a very interesting question. Law enforcement, it does get involved in these discussions. If there's a question here about how decisive a voice it is, I would say it isn't as decisive a voice as it might be. I think part of it is it's slightly ghettoized, because it's seen that the basic thing that people talk around when they're talking about reform in this area tends to be about suspicious activity reporting, which is fine because that's the main conduit of financial intelligence, if you like, going out from the private sector. And that's what they're dealing with, which is then they base their leads on, and further analysis and what have you. But the reality is they are the people are at the coalface. They are the people running the investigations. Then, of course, focusing on asset confiscation and all those aspects which are about the active disruption of the crime at the sort of sharp end. And I don't think, I feel from my own experience and from what I get from talking to people, that in some ways feels slightly semi-detached from the policy-making process, which is very much framed around government departments, regulators, what have you.
And then maybe the louder voices in the private sector as well.
You might very well think that. I couldn't possibly comment. So yeah, I think that's true. And I'm not sure that law enforcement necessarily see it as their role.
That's possible.
And I think that's a key point. I mean, I talked for this work to people in a European and North American context on the law enforcement side. And I would say the minority of those I spoke to, and there were quite a few, sort of seemed slightly puzzled when I made suggestions that they should be more heavily involved in the regulatory process, as if that's not our job, that's the regulator's job. And as I said to several of them, well, yes, it is currently, but maybe if we want to make this better connected, you should be more connected. And this, in my experience, this isn't necessarily anything about the way that we manage anti-money laundering. I think it's really about the way institutions are, because I've seen it in other areas such as cyber. I've seen it in counter-terrorism in different places in my government background, which is as a process of learning where you actually have to start demonstrating value by working more closely together. When you look at the National Economic Crime Plan in the UK, it's still at a fairly nascent stage. And has drawn a lot of the lessons that you've seen in cyber and CT and other areas that the UK government has brought this kind of connected approach together. I'm hopeful that we will start demonstrating more value there. I think one of the great things that I've experienced in doing this project is sitting in rooms with people from the FCA, the NCA, having conversations and knowing that those conversations are going on when you're not there. I know that's like a strange thing. So
no, absolutely.
Sometimes you have these, you have seminars and meetings and you think, this is the first time these people have met. This is incredible. But that's not the case, I think. And I think that's a really good sign here. So that's a positive, I would say.
I think that there does seem to be a good collaborative, increasingly collaborative feeling to the way that we tackle financial crime in this country. So looking at, improvements, let's talk about innovation, because this forms quite a big part of your paper. And I think there's wide scale acknowledgement within the industry that innovation is going to be essential to whatever happens next in anti-financial crime prevention. I really liked how you highlighted the benefits of bringing fraud and AML together. Do you think, as sort of functions within a business, do you think that there is much appetite for this in the industry? I've heard about it in bits and pieces more in the fintech space. Do you think in sort of big financial institutions there's an appetite to bring those two functions together?
I think it's easier in the fintech space, and having done some consultancy in that world, I've seen it too, because they're starting from scratch and they can look at what's been done before and say, really, do we need to have fraud and AML separate? And isn't fraud a predicate crime for money laundering? And shouldn't we be, et cetera, et cetera? So they make that connected thinking at a very early stage. If you were to, when I worked, I'm sure I won't get in trouble for saying this, when I worked at HSBC first, because I've worked at HSBC twice in my career, once as a proper banker of a kind, didn't last very long doing it, went off and did other things. And I always used to say, why is fraud, and why do we treat fraud and financial crime differently? They say, well, fraud, we lose money, and money laundering, we might make money. So we separate the two out. And I thought that was very interesting. So in fraud, of course, you focus on the losses and all the rest of it. That's not the only focus, of course, but that's one of the primary things that you end up talking about. And it wasn't necessarily seen as being part and parcel of the same thing. Now, as time goes by, and particularly in large organizations which start doing more in terms of financial intelligence about clients and potential clients, they start seeing the connections, not only between money laundering and fraud, but also between other predicate offences like bribery and corruption, particularly grand bribery and corruption, wildlife crime, cyber crime, massively, particularly in volume fraud and all the rest of it. And the obvious thing is, well, okay, why are we passing the parcel of this particular issue around here? And, I've witnessed cases where different parts of different institutions have known different things. It's the classic 9/11 thing, which is, this office knows this office knows this, but nobody puts it together.
Up, yeah.
And it's becoming quite obvious that they should do that. Now, is there an appetite? I think there's an appetite. There is an appetite to do it because people can see the potential benefits. I think it's hard, particularly in older institutions, because of the almost traditional mindset of it. And fraud investigators and AML investigators think of themselves in that sort of way. And they have their own ethos and ways of doing things. And I don't think that's beyond bringing together at all. I think it is. I think they can probably both learn a lot from each other about how they approach things. But it's, again, this is one of the things about this where it's not just about institutional change and saying, hey, presto, make that work. It's the cultural change, because there are people who've been doing these particular things, and there are professional examinations in different types of things. They have their own professional reputation. I think if you demonstrate value, which I think the places that are doing it, they are demonstrating value by connecting things together and giving a broader view of networks that are involved in financial crime, and also reducing costs for the institution in doing that. That's great. Over time, I think that becomes a dreadful cliched phrase, a no-brainer. But I think that takes time to work through and for people to accept it.
Absolutely. And in terms of, in other ways that people are bringing things together, connecting dots, and appetites also, you talk about, one area that innovation could be particularly useful is in the use of machine learning for transaction monitoring. We've heard this sort of, people have been speaking about this for a while, and you sort of wonder, well, when are we going to see it? When's it going to happen? From the people that you sort of interviewed for this project, what are people doing? What are the barriers that are still being perceived for adoption, and how are we going to overcome those?
Most of the places I've talked to are doing it tend to be bigger institutions because they've got the money to do it. The problems that those institutions tend to have is their data. Because, of course, if you're going to use machine learning on data, you've got to have a lot of it. And yes, the more, the better. And as long as there's a certain level, it can accept a certain level of noise in the data. But if you've got huge gaps, massive amounts of not just duplication, but multiple duplication, you've got a big old process to go through of data transformation before you can get there. A lot of institutions hold their data, transactions data, in mutually exclusive older systems which need to be brought together. often into what is termed a data lake. That process takes ages. And that is one of the reasons I think that it's taking longer perhaps than people would have otherwise liked. Part of the difficulty, I think, is that I think there's a certain amount of who people are reticent about being first as well, because they want to know what we're talking about competitive issues. They want to know what their competitors are doing. Most of the big international banks are using or experimenting with machine learning in lots of different ways, and they're all being very cagey. I do mention in the report, and I mentioned it again, sort of, give a thumbs up to a former employer. HSBC have been a bit more open about this in the last year or so, that they're making positive step forwards. I've heard it from other big banks as well, who are, I think the issue now is moving more on in those places to making sure the regulator's happy. It's the model validation issue, because there are lots of big issues around, is it a black box or not? I think we're there. I think we are getting there. And I think that the value has been privately demonstrated in several institutions that is identifying anomalous activity which might well be suspicious and would not have been identified by credit rule-based systems. I think it's there. I think the issue now is running that system alongside current rule-based systems and comparing and contrasting for a period of time to make regulators ensure that regulators are happy.
And this is what FinCEN recommends in their innovation statement.
Indeed.
And just what we've been waiting for the UK regulators / government to make a similar sort of statement. And in the economic crime plan, it does talk about the need to increase sort of,
it does.
Positive feelings towards the use of, reg techs and other forms of innovative technology. Could you think of an incentive model that would work for this?
For the use of machine learning?
Or just wider innovative technology?
I think there's a number of different ways you approach this. I mean, I would say if you're going to innovate in a commercial context, you have to treat businesses as businesses. So if you were to look at the financial services sector and other obligated entities, their whole issues are around cost, profit, and also reputation and regulatory issues. These are the lifeblood of those organizations. So you have to incentivize. And I know some people will say, well, that's dreadful. They should just do it because it's the right thing to do. Yes, that I accept that partly, but the reality is you can't change the beast. You have to give potential, it could affect regulatory examinations in terms of, getting brownie points or whatever it might be in their regulatory examinations for actually innovating and trying, or maybe working with colleagues in different institutions to do that. It might come from all sorts of capital offsets. It might come through, relief in taxation. I think there are lots of ways to do this. Public reputational commendation for doing these kind of things. We spend a lot of time, and I've done it too when I've worked in government, criticising private institutions when they go wrong. I think there are practical things that can be done which would incentivise private institutions to do the right thing as well. I think it's unavoidable. In some ways, money needs to come into that too.
So I think what you're saying here is we need to be innovative about praising innovation.
I think that's right. And I think we have to be realistic that we're talking about businesses here, and compliance costs are substantial.
Absolutely.
I mean, sort of globally, I think
it's in the billions.
It's in the billions, and one has to ask himself, is that cost effective? Potentially machine learning is going to reduce the number of false positives if it works as well as it seems like it can. That's got to be a positive from a cost perspective. So therefore, why not encourage organizations to go in that direction by giving them the financial incentive to at least make the investment at the beginning to see whether it works for them?
Absolutely. So before we finish, could you give me one takeaway you would like a private sector compliance professional would take from this paper?
I think the key thing is learning from others. And I think that was something that we were talking about before. Evidence is a key theme throughout this, not only for governments and regulators and law enforcement, but also for financial institutions that are trying to develop. I would say get involved. If you're a fintech, for example, go and join one of the sort of associations that are developing around that, because they are sharing knowledge about how to innovate. Talk to the regulator about it. Become part of the consortia, different consortia which are developing that are actually helping share that knowledge. I think that's a key thing to be doing. Learn from others. It's very, very easy to get bamboozled, and I'd be very careful saying this here because I've done it. I've pitched to people myself. You think, okay, I've got a screening issue. I want new screening technology. I'll get X, Y, Z in to do pitches, and you get lost a little bit in, people are trying to sell you something. Is it what you need? I think you need to be thinking very seriously about what you do need by talking to others in your field in sort of more collaborative environments before you actually start answering the question about what I'm going to spend money on, because it might not actually be the right thing for you. And we've talked about, the risk-based approach. Part of a risk-based approach is effectively is being realistic about what you need where, and not necessarily spending money you don't need to. And I think the only way you really do that, innovating, is by talking to other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sharing.
That's a lovely note to finish on. On the subject of sharing, this paper will hit the press, also known as the RUSI website, in early October. If you would like it delivered directly to your inbox, you can sign up to the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies mailing list by visiting www.rusi.org/the CFCS, and you will find it there. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much, Matthew, for coming in today and telling us all about your paper.
Thank you, Isabella. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That concludes the first full-length episode of the Suspicious Transaction Report. I hope you enjoyed it. Next episode, we'll be discussing the terrorist financing risk of social media with Florence Keane. I've been your host, Isabella Chase, and this podcast has been supported by Accurus Risk Intelligence. It was produced by Tom Ascott, edited by Narrative Audio, and additional research was carried out by Kayla Eisenman.